other people or indifferent to other people, then we are missing a very, very deep thing, because as Aristotle noted, we are not only rational, we are also naturally social beings. And one of the things that I've noticed when it comes to the findings in neuroscience is that people get amazed, right? Or they go, wow, when human beings socialize, this area of the brain lights up, and it means that they are having fun. It is a good thing to socialize. Now, that's a surprise to someone with a mechanistic framework on the way that human beings deal with each other. But if we deal with it on a more teleological, like organism style way of thinking, as the ancients used to, then we would predict that dealing with other people and dealing with my community at large in a positive, constructive way is going to make me feel good.
Right. So I think that actually gets us to the next section. Both of us identify as conservatives, and I think, you know, we want to also examine other different political theories, the most prominent ones being liberalism and libertarianism.
Yeah.
But before we get there, what would you say is conservatism? What is a proper conservative supposed to believe?
So I have to first confess that my political awakening began about 8 or 9 months ago. I was very immersed in metaphysics, theology, natural theology, ethics, and so on and so forth. But I didn't really think much about politics in terms of studying it that much. So this is, I guess, an 8-month-old build up to this idea. So to me, what a conservative properly is first and foremost someone who recognizes the sovereignty of the individual and the way that the political hierarchy is set up in the way that I just mentioned about it being an organic system, where simultaneously we make the government, we make the political society, and the political society educates us. And I think that that's a very important thing to take note, is that when we pass certain laws or whatever have you, we're not just passing a law to satisfy particular rights that someone has, but we are also educating the population by saying, we think that this precept is so important and so worthy of our consideration that we're going to codify it in an official document. I was listening to a lecture a while back. The man was saying that for someone like a Socrates or a Plato or an Aristotle, what law is the externalization and the universalization of human reason itself. It's not just a sentence in an act somewhere, but it's literally the, if you will, the manifestation of the individual person in the aggregate form. And that's one part of it. Second part that I would very much stress, and it's inherent in the name conservatism, right? To conserve what came beforehand. And it's not the same as a traditionalism, which is just, you know, we did it, therefore keep on doing it. No. Traditions exist for a very, very important reason. And I believe I was reading a paper by Edward Fazer, very, very smart man. He was saying that when it comes to tradition, right? Whenever we come up with a new idea, let's say go back 1,000 years ago, we came up with a certain understanding of a particular part in the world, right? How to be a human being. And then I was taught generation after generation after generation. And that just is what a tradition is. The thing, if you will, it's to use the jargon of social, I guess, biology, it's a meme that was passed down from generation to generation. So to say that tradition ought to be overthrown is to say that the wisdom that's been passed down over millennia and refined ought to be turned away from, which is strange to think of, because we would never say that an individual person, as they grow up, ought to just forget everything they've learned at every single year and start anew. You take what you've learned, use it, assimilate it. If it's worthless, get rid of it. But if it works and it's true, keep it. And what a conservative really does is look at the wisdom throughout human history and make sure that we understand where these come from, meaning studying the people who first came up with it and understanding the way that that thought develops over time.
I've noticed too that the rhetoric on, you know, overthrowing traditions, to some extent, it's based on a very high degree of arrogance on the part of the people who say that. You know, because the idea is that, oh, well, we're superior now, we don't need these superstitions and so forth. And that means that we can just do away with this tradition. But then when you ask the individual, what are you going to replace this tradition with? They have no response. They have nothing to replace it with. So that, I think that's a good place to start off, by discussing all those aspects. There are different places that we can go here, but I think we should just go straight into the different political philosophies that are available, because I'm sure that, you know, it's more interesting to kind of critique than it is to always defend. So let's go into liberalism, right? So liberalism is considered the furthest thing from conservatism. Usually it's on the left-right spectrum. First, let's define what liberalism is, and then second, you know, what are the problems with it?
Yeah, so from my understanding, liberalism it's kind of similar to conservatism, but it has certain differences that are important. So one of them is, you know, freedom seems to me to be the real driving force behind it. And tied to that is a conception that every single human has an intrinsic equality or quality about themselves that makes all humans equal in that, I guess, way of thinking. So, for example, the move towards bringing about abolishing slavery, right? We would say that it was a liberal idea to go from people having slaves and the institution being in place, to saying, no, there is an intrinsic equality between a black man and a white man and an Asian man or whatever have you. Therefore, this person deserves to be treated as such. So in that way, it's very close to a conservative way of thinking. But where it begins to, at least me, begin to go a little bit crazy is there tend to be very few specific guidelines as to what it means to be equal. Yes. And this is where it goes from being an equality-based system to an equalitarianism, where equality at the expense of everything else, right? And what this does is it eliminates first of all, the natural differences that we have as humans, right? I mean, I'm a big fan of the NBA. I am not a LeBron James, right? I love basketball very, very much, but just for me to say, look, I should play in the NBA, right? Why don't they let me? Well, because there's a criteria that you have to meet. And I think this applies to many, many areas in life. And what the liberal ideal does is it takes that and says, okay, that works when it comes to sports and when it comes to education or whatever have you, right? In that not everyone can get to study. You know, you have to reach a certain threshold, passing examinations and so on and so forth. But when it comes to things like money, resources, what is the obvious conclusion from the fact that there are billionaires and that there are impoverished people? Well, the obvious conclusion is that since everyone is equal in some vague way, therefore everyone has the intrinsic ability to gain wealth, but some people don't. What's the obvious conclusion? It becomes a zero-sum way of thinking. Either the poor people have willingly given the money away to the rich people, or they're willingly giving away the opportunities to the rich people, or the rich have unjustly stolen the opportunities from the impoverished people. And this way of thinking, I think, extends to other areas as well, not just monetary. So that, to me, I guess, is a broad way of understanding it, to me.
And going to the point about equality, I think that one important aspect, too, of the liberal mindset is a type of social deconstructionism. So, you know, Rousseau says that a man is born free, but everywhere he's in chains. And it goes back to this idea of tabula rasa, right? That all of us are essentially the same, and then society is the one that writes on all these social constructs that limit us in different ways, and then institutionalizes those constructs such that we suffer in life, right? So the goal of the liberal is to get to this state of equality. But to do that, they believe then that the social constructs that are limiting them in one capacity or another are not limitations that are reasonable, that they're limitations that are foreign and arbitrary, right? And that the proper task is then to destroy them. What do you think about that line of reasoning?
Yeah, the arbitrary part's very actually important to understand, because going back to my studies, I did a unit on race and identity. So we got into gender and things of that nature, racism, sexism. And one of the things that I've been trying to properly formulate in my mind is, what does it mean to be racist, sexist, and in general, an unjustly discriminatory person? And it seems to me that a big component there is the arbitrary nature or the arbitrary way that people get given opportunities. So we would agree with the liberals or the liberally minded people that equality of opportunity is the best starting point, at least as a working way of thinking about it. But if it is the case that I'll use, for example, a black person who goes and applies for a job, and they get turned away, right? And because they were black. Now that's arbitrary. The reason that that's unjust isn't just, unjust, let's not talk about it, just leave it at that, because that tends to happen a lot. People say, that's just racist, let's not analyze why, right? It's racist because it's an arbitrary thing. There's nothing intrinsic about being black that entails that they'll do well or not at any given job. Each person has to be seen as an individual. And so I guess they take that form and they apply it to society at large. If there are certain groups who are not doing as well as other groups, it isn't because of cultural or behavioral differences, or in this case, subcultural and behavioral differences. It is because there are arbitrary blocks in place that have nothing to do with the intrinsic worth of the person, nothing to do with their aptitude or their deserving to get certain jobs. It's precisely because the system is set up, and I agree with this to a certain degree. I mean, we're not living in a perfect system by any stretch of the imagination. It's set up to make it more difficult for certain people to get into positions where they ought to be. Yeah.
And another aspect that I've heard about liberalism is that liberalism is based off of a much more idealistic view of human nature and what we are capable of. So for the conservative, right, the conservative is very conscientious and cautious about the changes that we make, because the conservative knows, for example, that if we go too extreme, right, and go outside of that Aristotelian golden mean, and we go towards a more extreme end at the expense of everything else that we know, right, then we could destroy an entire society, undermine everything. To give you an example, when we discuss, for example, social justice, right, the aim of social justice is towards the just society. And to have a society, you need to have basic institutions. And for some of the liberals, they believe that, well, no, these institutions are the things that are holding us down. Take, for example, the institution of marriage, right? The institution of marriage, traditionally expressed as the union of a man and a woman, in some ways, like, throughout history, the distribution of labor and so forth, the way in which women have to sacrifice sometimes their careers, this is deemed, to be a kind of arbitrary, unnecessary, and wrong type of limitation. And in the process, therefore, they say, we can do away with that institution and still have a society. And it's like, that line of reasoning seems to be very difficult, because conservatives also believe in the nature of cooperation, of self-sacrifice, and recognizing limitations. So could you just give a little commentary about the views of human nature and society?
Yeah, I think that is very much correct, in that the liberal way of conceiving or of conceptualizing of human nature tends to be idealistic, tends to be egalitarian in a good and a bad way. I'm I'm personally an optimist. I think that we can achieve, it's metaphysically possible to achieve a very good society, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I believe I was listening to Thomas Sowell, the Quest for Cosmic Justice, and he was saying that the problem is that we can have egalitarian ideals, but we have to practically make sure that we don't be foolish in how we go about trying to bring it about. So I would say that a real conservative is an idealist, is an egalitarian as well, but the way that we go about bringing about a good, just society, the perfect society, is not by implementing measures or implementing laws that are idealistic right now. We implement gradual laws to change the zeitgeist of the entire nation. And so when everyone gets on board, then we move on to that next level. And this is where the critique of revolutions comes in, is that a revolution, because human nature likes gradual change, sudden changes works for some people, right? We're on a bell curve, right? You know, some people like rapid changes, they need change all the time. And I think that the revolutionary attitude is attractive to that kind of person, but the majority of people aren't like that. So when they try and impose a revolutionary way of thinking onto the majority of people who won't handle that rapid change well, then we get idealistic and egalitarian ways of thinking, conceptualizing of human beings as perfect. And the tabula rasa is very important here, right? We can just make clean breaks from our past and just move on and become totally different overnight. Or, you know, if we have the right education in place, and we can teach kids to be these perfectly rational, perfectly just, you know, woke people. It doesn't quite work that way. So I would say that the conservative way of thinking is the teleological one, right? Where gradual increments towards a perfectionist ideal, but it's an ideal. It's never going to happen.
Yeah, and I guess another interesting aspect of liberalism is kind of, well, first off, the revolutionary attitude is one that is very impatient, and in some ways it can become very intolerant of any limitations on its potential, right? So if you say to somebody that, you know, the potential is limited, we have to be very careful about our steps, and what they really hear is, no, I'm defending the oppressive order, and I want to keep the status quo. Right. So then there's that impatient revolutionary attitude, and there's also that idea of, you know, privilege. Right. So only the privileged people can say, you know, we need to be careful about this. We need to be slow. Right. And when the conservative says there are some institutions and ideas worth preserving in society that have given us a sense of identity and sustenance, that's viewed as, no, you want to keep the status quo because it benefits you and because you're privileged. So then I think we're now entering into the realm of identity politics and kind of, you know, power structures and so forth. So first, let's understand what that liberal idea is and how one goes about addressing that.
Yeah. So going into identity politics, my understanding is that it has good motives, again, very good motives, because what it says is that we have to think about the person as an individual, and again, an individuated being, right? If we concede that certain people have advantages over other people based on historical facts, right? Then someone who has more than one of the advantageous identities is going to be more advantaged. And by the other extreme is a person with more disadvantaged or underprivileged variables to the identity is going to be less advantaged, which to me is commonsensically, that makes total sense, right? But the problem with identity politics is that it almost tends towards a fratric way of understanding justice and groups. And what I mean by that is this. Fratric justice is tribe A, tribe B. Someone in tribe A kills someone in tribe B. And if we can't find the individual from tribe A, tribe B picks someone from tribe A to then kill or to punish. And then the balance becomes then re-established. So it it assimilates the individual into the group completely. So group identity becomes the most important thing, or one of the most important things, and we lose the individual in that process. So in the spirit of trying to
turns the individual into a sacrificial lamb. That's what I'm getting.
It turns the individual into a sacrificial lamb, and it turns them into nothing but their group identity. So I am not Jeremy. I am Turkish, Muslim, philosophy student, 6'3", whatever I am, right? I fit into that mold. Therefore, when, for example, when a evil Islamic terrorist goes something up, I'm expected to denounce that because I'm a Muslim. So that's saying, look, Jeremy, you have a responsibility to speak for your kin. And I'm like, yeah, I do to a certain degree, but I'm not going to take responsibility for what they did. They are an autonomous, free person who, if we're going to be truly just about this, it's them and them alone, and the people who taught them that crap who is responsible for that. And you hear fairly often people saying things like, well, as a trans activist, I speak for all transgendered people. No, you don't. As a Muslim, I speak for all Muslims. No, you don't. As a Christian, right? I mean, the Westboro Baptist Church doesn't speak for you, right? As a, I don't know, think of a black extremist. They don't speak for all black people. We have to make clear the distinctions between culture, individuals, groups, before we begin to take the ideals of identity politics and implement them properly. Because, as I was saying a bit earlier, they're very valuable to understand, because the spirit of it is to understand the specific intersection, or if you will, the intersectionality, right, within the individual person, right? Where, yes, we have to think about the fact that if you are a woman and you are black and so on and so forth, there are probably going to be more challenges for you than if you are a white male, or in this case, an Asian male, right? Because, you know what, you guys get into the unis at a much higher level and a much higher rate, I think, than everyone else. You'd be at the top of that hierarchy, right? But you're a person of color, so no, you're not. At least so they say, right?
Yeah. And, the thing is that when you look at liberalism and the ethical ideals that it upholds, a lot of conservatives say, race doesn't matter, race is irrelevant. And in my experience, what I've seen is that, no, race really does matter. And, just as we criticize Marxists for believing in a classless society, we should be criticized for thinking that we could live in a raceless one, right? Because there is really that sense of self-identity, that sense of self-identification. Because for me, as an Asian American man, right, like when I was younger, I thought, I'm just American. Don't talk about my Asian ethnicity and background. And as I grew older, I began to realize that, wait, no. Like, the people who tell me not to think about that, they also have their own cultures that are connected to their race. So why, it's like kind of like I need that sense of identity myself.
Yes.
So
I would say so.
Do you see that? Do you see that point?
Yes, I would certainly say that. And it's just to go off on that for a second. What's important, I think, and what's being lost in the general narrative is the differences between culture and race. And what tends to happen is that in everyday talk, we tend to conflate these two together. And that ends up leading to problems. So, for example, it came to my attention that Charles Murray, he wrote The Bell Curve, right?
Yes.
Now, I haven't read it. I've got no idea what it's about. But apparently one of the facts or the implications in that book was that there is a correlation between race and IQ. Now, that's if that's true, that's merely a descriptive thing. We're not saying that because you're a certain race, therefore you have a low IQ. And if you're of the race, then you can't have a good IQ or whatever have you. But what ends up happening is we are given that fact, and rather than saying, okay, the fact exists, let's analyze whether or not it's the cause is cultural, or if the cause is in fact racial. Well, the extremes are, well, how dare you even mention that fact? If it is a fact, how dare you even mention that? Or the other extreme is, look, you're not taking this seriously enough. You know, you're Asian, so therefore you are smart. You should take advantage of it. Don't complain about your lot. And it does open up the room for racist thinking, and people definitely are racist in this regard. But I personally believe that, going back to the liberal way of thinking, all humans are inherently equal when it comes to, I think that we all have the capacity to become as smart as we can possibly be, right? You know, we have a great potential to learn many, many things. And the fact that there are people from every walk of life who achieve all sorts of different intellectual accomplishments is, at least on a common sense level, evidence that it's not a racial thing per se. It's more of a cultural thing. If people are not educated, and who, if their entire life is not geared towards them being successful in an academic way or in a health way, then they're not going to get that way. And actually, when we say that, no, we need to have certain, like, very, very, if you will, affirmative action, right? We need to have that to a very, very high level, right? I agree with it to a certain level, but if we say we need it a lot, then that seems to me to border on a different kind of racism almost. It's saying that, well, you need to have all of these things in order to get into university because you're just a Arab, right? And that's taking away the sovereignty from the individual. It seems to me to be the case. But again, we have to think about it from an individual point of view. You know, each person has a specific circumstance that'll dictate their opportunities. And that's what we want to really try and bring about. And thinking about the group the individual from a group point of view, and to say that, well, you identify with this group, therefore you are the stereotypical this, it doesn't work. It doesn't bring about justice, and it just ends up causing more confusion and more problems than it solves. It seems to me anyway.
And the most important part, I would say, or rather the most important writer for conservative thought, was Edmund Burke, considered the father of modern conservatism. And one of the ideas that Edmund Burke discusses when it comes to these injustices and disparities are what he calls the smaller platoons of society. You know, the basic civil institutions, churches and organizations and community centers, right, that are helping individuals on an everyday basis. So yes, these disparities exist, these problems exist, but everyday human interaction and us fulfilling our duties to one another, that's what's supposed to happen. But when the government gets so big and public policy ends up breaking those types of social capital, then we lose something great in society. And that actually goes to the second interesting topic that I want to discuss, which is libertarianism. So libertarianism seems to be, for those who don't like conservatism and those who don't like liberalism, many people think, well, it's obvious that I have to be a libertarian then. Libertarian seems to be a socially liberal standpoint, but economically, fiscally conservative, right? So let's take what libertarianism is and then discuss, you know, whether or not it works.
Well, yeah, from my understanding, libertarianism is the political idea that we should have as minimum of a government as we can, minimal government. And it takes, I guess, the concept of individual sovereignty to that next level, where it says that, you know, I am the ultimate master of my ship. I am the one who, it's almost Kantian actually, you know, it says, you know, I can legislate my own laws, my own moral laws, my own civic laws, and so on and so forth. And one of the big things in it is that they say, well, the government kind of sucks at everything. For whatever reason, the bureaucratic nature of it is such that for some reason, some governments just don't function very well, but many of them don't function very well. So why not, instead of giving the government power, let's put the power back where it belongs, into the individual, into small communities, or in the case of the US, give the states more power than the federal government. and have the federal government there in place only to secure the most minimum rights. So self-defense, that is, say, defend the borders of any given country, maybe roads and things like that, and ensure that there is a stable enough society to allow a free market to be free, genuinely free. That's basically what it is, from my understanding.
Yeah, I would definitely, consider that, right? That is how the libertarian understands himself. I think another important aspect of libertarianism is the belief, right, that we are essentially born free, and that government is an imposition upon that freedom, right? If somebody says you need to cooperate, you need to get along, right, that is a sense of imposing upon my individuality and my freedom.
Yep.
And I think that libertarians, their main ethical principle is the harm principle, right? So if I'm articulating it properly, there's a difference between the harm principle and the non-aggression principle. The harm principle simply says that human beings are free to do whatever they want insofar as they do not harm another individual, right? And then aside from themselves, so they want to harm themselves, they can do that. But if they want to harm somebody else, a third party, so to speak, then that's not fair. The second is the non-aggression principle, which is the idea that, well, we don't really use force until we are met with force, if I'm understanding that properly. What would you say to those two ethical principles? Are they sufficient for, let's say, grounding our ethical theories?
No. I think they are deficient. And I'll go to the first one for a second, right? You can do anything you want as long as you don't harm others. And you have property rights over yourself to harm yourself and do whatever you want with yourself. I think that the latter part of that's wrong, precisely because of what it means to be a moral being and what moral principles are. Moral principles don't apply to everyone else but myself, right? Moral principles apply to humans. Therefore, from what I can recall, it was St. Augustine who said that taking a human life is a crime of murder, and it doesn't make it any less murder when I kill myself. I'm taking an innocent human life. And it seems to me that what's happening there is that, and this is tying back into the liberalism, autonomy is more important than life.
Yes.
In this circumstance, right? And I think for myself, probably for yourself, it's the other way around. Autonomy exists for the sake of my being able to freely pursue my ends in life, to survive and then thrive. So then to say that in the John Stuart Mill kind of fashion, in a John Stuart Mill kind of fashion, that the individual has the autonomy to even take their own life, because that's the degree to which they have self-ownership, that to me is not thinking about it the correct way. He's putting the cart before the horse there. And so when I harm myself, and this is a thing which I very rarely hear being spoken about, because we tend to always hear about, you're a good person when you help others out. You're a good person, morally speaking, when you do good for others. But I very rarely hear people say, you're a morally good person when you take care of yourself. Because if we're taking this seriously, and if moral principles that are universal are true, I am a part of that universal framework.
Yes.
So it doesn't follow that because I am born free, that I have the freedom to harm myself, because the purpose of being born free is to pursue my ends. If I use my freedom to act contrary to my ends, or to deprive myself of those ends, that is a perversion of the faculty of freedom. So that's one thing that I would say on that. The non-aggression principle, I think, is pretty much right. We shouldn't, don't be the aggressor ever, unless you absolutely have to, and I can't imagine when it would be, but because we are good philosophers, we want to make a very broad and covering all the bases kind of statement.
Well, okay, so I think the problem is that when the libertarian claims those two are sufficient for a political theory, right? That a political theory for an entire community of persons. But let me now go to a more common
Mm.
argument from the libertarian, which is that taxation is theft, right? So
Right.
typically for the conservative, I think the conservative could agree to some extent that a state needs to exist. That's what I think most conservatives would believe, but they believe that state is only justified to a certain extent, and that there are limits to that power, right? But like one of the legitimate powers of that state to even exist is taxation itself. Now, it shouldn't be an
Mm.
extensive regime of taxation. If it's a small government, a limited government, then it wouldn't require that much taxation. So the argument goes.
Yeah.
But the libertarian says no. Taxation is theft. It's stealing from the fruits of my labor and so forth. Is
Right.
taxation theft, Jeremy?
I don't think so. No. It's not. Well, I mean, it seems to me that the amount of taxation there is the most important thing. So we would agree that if we get taxed 100%, that is theft. That is all the fruits of our labor are owned by the government, aka communism. That's obviously theft, like the bad kind of, the extreme form of communism, right? That is theft. If I get taxed zero, where do the resources come from for the government to do anything, right? That's to be some place that comes from. And since we agree that government sucks usually, then we can't rely on the government to make money for itself. And if we truly believe that the government is by and for the people, and it's the government is genuinely interested in the people's interests, then we would have no issue with getting taxed a certain amount to make my conditions to then make more money more certain, because that's what really taxes are all about. So to say that categorically taxation is theft doesn't take into consideration the fact that I can only make money in a free society which is secured by the resources the government uses based on my taxes. At least for right now. I mean, maybe in some future time we can have a state where we have a government that can genuinely make its own money and tax the citizens zero, but we're not there yet. And saying that taxation is theft, therefore get rid of all taxation now, is committing the same fallacy that the liberal egalitarians make in trying to implement idealistic principles and laws right now. Doesn't work.
Yes, and that's exactly one of the issues that I've seen with libertarianism. They don't realize how close they are to communism in many of the lines of argument they're using. So to give you one example, I was once debating a libertarian, and I said, okay, give me a historical example. And this was like a radical anarcho-libertarian, right? So no government at all, people can manage themselves. I say, okay, give me a historical example of where that has worked, where a state was not needed to govern, a quite large group of people, right? Or something like a quasi-proto-state. And they said, well, look, that's an availability heuristic, okay? Like, it's not fair to me because, it's possible, but it just hasn't happened yet. And I say, wait, isn't that the same argument that the communists use? They say that,
true libertarian hasn't tried yet.
Yeah, exactly. And, some of my friends have responded, well, no, Swan, that's not fair. There are times where anarchism has worked. And it's usually the case that in those anarchist societies, everybody has the same common ethics, right? They understand what those principles are, but they will also enforce it on each other, which seems to almost be like a form of a state. Not exactly, but to somewhat like a proto-state, and this goes back to Aristotle's idea of us being naturally political social animals. What's your thought on that argument of anarcho-libertarianism?
It's a bit of a stretch for me to think of it as a useful and a plausible system. And I'll actually go to the metaphysical side of it and the human nature side of it. So we are by nature social. We are by nature political. And what that means is that part of fulfilling my nature, that is to say, part of fulfilling my ends and being happy, is in living in a political and social community that is flourishing. So giving back is very, very important in that regard. And taxes are a part of that. Giving back the resources in whatever way that I possibly can is a big part of that. And I think that where the libertarianism and the libertarians and the anarcho-libertarians tend to really be annoyed is they say, big argument is, well, look at these people on welfare, here in Australia, on the dole, right? These people who just live off the labors of others, and you have intergenerational welfare families, right? That's not just. Therefore, let's get rid of that part of taxation, or let's get rid of that part of giving back to the community. But without realizing that, yes, they should not appropriate the resources of those who actually worked for them. But not everyone can do that. There are genuine people who literally must rely on other people to take care of them. And since we can't just leave it up to the charities, because they can do a lot, but they can't do everything. We need to have some kind of centralized system to take care of the most needy. And this is where I love Rawls on this regard. Rawls.
Oh, yeah.
John Rawls, where he says that allocate resources such that they take care of the least advantaged members in society first, before they take care of the most advantaged. And I think that is a decent principle if applied well, because we are only as good as a society and as in human beings as we take care of our most needy. That is, say, elderly, children, and people with disabilities, I think.
Yeah.
And so again, the libertarians don't quite fully get that, because they think more on an atomistic conception and on a more mechanistic conception. My route to happiness, which is the whole point of having a political community, right? Aristotle argues, why does the polis exist? Why do we tend towards political modes of affiliation as opposed to just small communities or just families? Well, because it's our natural inclination to live in that state. And because it's natural, it's organic. It comes from my DNA, if you will, is what pushes me towards that. I'm using DNA in a very loose sense here. To be more precise, I guess, the very fabric of my being is oriented towards that way of living, not towards the atomistic way of, let me just get my own. Let me just have my, my 10 acres with my, cattle and my ability to shoot whatever I want, and that's going to make me happy. It's not. Very rarely will that make you genuinely happy.
And for the most part, that libertarian view of life is incredibly antisocial and selfish in and of itself. And what's really fascinating is that I think this was a meme that was shared on your page. It was a picture of I think Arnold and one of his friends kind of like doing the handshake, and you see their bulging muscles, right? And then in the middle it says selfish motives, and then the one in the arms is radical libertarianism and radical communism, if I'm not mistaken, if that was a meme of yours. That's definitely...
So I'll say one thing on that. So every single meme that I share is mine, as in I don't I don't create the artwork, but I guess I take the templates and I whatever content's on there is mine. Yeah, that's precisely right. So when I thought of that, I was like, yeah, that's very common amongst these two ways of thinking, as you alluded to earlier. Libertarian arguments almost parallel communist arguments, in that it's about what can I get, what can I, what can secure my intrinsic and I guess limited ends. They don't think that way, but that's what, to someone like myself and yourself, who thinks that part of your ends is to make the community flourish. Part of your happiness is constituted in making others flourish. Therefore, having that